So normally, talking to the Plaid API requires having a full stack application set up, right? Like you've got a client where your user actually authorizes Plaid to talk to their bank, and then you've got a server that does most of the actual communication back and forth with the Plaid service. But sometimes you don't feel like setting up a whole full stack application. Like maybe you're a non-engineering type of person and you don't really know how, or you are an engineering type of person and you just don't feel like it. Well, for those situations, there's a tool we like to use called Postman that simplifies the process of talking to the Plaid API. And I'm going to show you how to get started with it on today's episode of Plaid Academy. So this video goes into a fair amount of detail around what Plaid is, what Postman is, and how the two products work together. If you're not very familiar with either one of these products, great, you're in the right place. I'll explain all of that in the course of this video. On the other hand, if you're already a pretty experienced developer and you're like, you know what, just give me like the quick tour and I'll figure out the rest, go check out the Plaid and Postman in 3 minutes video, which is linked in the description below and probably up in one of these corners somewhere. And let me know which version you like best in the comments. We're kind of experimenting. It's fun. So the general idea behind Plaid is that we provide your application with a single service that you can talk to, which connects your app with thousands of different banks out there. No matter who the bank is or how their infrastructure is set up, Plaid abstracts away all the weird quirks and edge cases of having to interact with each one of these banks and lets you request and receive data in the same format every time. Now, most Plaid-powered applications are going to be full-stack applications. That is, you've got a client and a server, and the Plaid service alongside all the financial institutions that it talks to. Now, for the most part, your web and mobile clients aren't going to be talking to Plaid directly. Most of the time, it's going to be your servers that are doing most of the work talking back and forth with Plaid. If your user needs to get a list of their most recent bank transactions, for example, they'll do that by having their client talk to your server, which then communicates with Plaid. Plaid grabs that information from the user's bank and sends it back to your server to send back up to your client. Now, part of the reason for this is security. When your server requests data from Plaid, it sends across both a client ID and a secret to prove that your application really is who it says it is. These things can't exist on the client. It'd be too easy for an attacker to dig them up, so they stay server-side. But also, in most real-world applications, your server is where you're going to be doing most of your business logic anyway, right? Like if you want to approve your user for a loan or start up a transfer of money, that's the kind of sensitive transaction that should really be performed on a server in an environment that you trust. The only time we really need your client to be involved is when your users connect Plaid to their banks. That's going to be done on the client, and most of the UI work there is handled for you by Plaid using a client-side widget thingy that we call Link. So let's look at what happens when a user authorizes Plaid to retrieve their information from a bank on behalf of your application, because we're going to need to perform some of these steps to get Plaid working when we use Postman. Like I said, a lot of the initial sign-in work is going to happen using Link on the client. And I'm actually going to skip over most of the details here because it's not really relevant for this video. Just know that by the time the user has finished connecting Plaid to their bank, a couple of important things have happened. One, over on the Plaid service, we've created something called an item. An item basically represents a user's login to a bank and typically has one or more accounts associated with it. When I connect my bank, for instance, my checking and savings account are both associated with a single item. The second thing that happens is that your client gets back what is known as a public token. This is basically a unique string that is associated with the item you just created. But for various security reasons, this token is considered dirty. It's not one we want to rely on long term. So it really only has one purpose, for your client to send it back down to your server, which can then send it back to Plaid. Plaid can then exchange this public token for a more permanent access token. Now, this access token stays on your server. It doesn't go back up to the client. And from then on, anytime your server wants to get information from Plaid, it sends across its client ID and secret, along with this access token to indicate which user's item you want to get this information from. So remember that basic flow. You get a public token from the client, exchange it for an access token, and then use that access token to talk to Plaid in the future. Now, there's a few ways that you or your server would perform these requests against the Plaid service. If you were building a real application, you'd be using Plaid's libraries to make this call for you. For instance, a call to fetch a user's last 20 financial transactions might look something like this using the Python library. But these calls to the Plaid service are just HTTP calls. So for smaller use cases, it's pretty common for developers to make those calls a little more manually. For instance, most desktop machines come bundled with a command line tool called curl, which can make HTTP calls for you. Turns out, though, not everybody's a fan of command line tools, and in practice, these calls start to get pretty verbose when you have to add in like all the access tokens and data that goes along with some of these requests. Oh, you've got a typo up there, and you know what? Never mind. I certainly don't want to type this out by hand, and I suspect I'm not the only developer who's created a big, ugly text file full of curl commands that I might need to copy and paste from one day. I mean, look at this thing. What a mess. So that's where Postman comes in. Basically, it's a tool that handles making these HTTP calls that's a lot more organized than a big old text file, but still easier to use than creating a full-blown application. Actually, I should point out, Postman does do a lot more than just simplify making these calls, but that's what we're going to be using it for today. And one way it makes this process easier is by allowing companies like Plaid to publish their APIs, that is their set of acceptable REST endpoints that you can talk to, into a file. You can just load up this file into Postman, modify these calls slightly for your own testing needs, and then run them without having to copy and paste lots of different header files and data blocks and whatnot. It's just all in the tool ready to use. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to use the Postman collection published by Plaid to take on the form of our server in this scenario. And through some special debugging magic, we're going to take on the role of a server just as it's received a public token from our client, so we don't have to worry about this whole beginning part where a user signs in through link, at least, not today. Now to get started, you're going to need three things. First, you'll need a Plaid developer account, which you can get over at dashboard.plaid.com. You won't need more than sandbox access to get started, and I'll talk more about what that means a little bit later. Next, you'll need a Postman account, which you can sign up for over at postman.com. And finally, this is optional, but I do recommend you download and install the Postman desktop client. You don't need to do this if you really don't want to. Everything works in a browser too, but I happen to think the desktop client is just nicer to work with. All right, let's get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is visit the GitHub page for the Postman collection. Easiest way to find it is probably just follow the link in the documentation, or you can probably find it in the description for this video. Next, from this page here, I'm going to click on Run in Postman. What this is going to do is take the collection of HTTP calls and sample responses that Plaid has published and load it up directly into Postman. I will click Postman for Mac to run it on my desktop app, and I will say, yes, go ahead and open Postman. Now this will load up my app, and it's going to ask me to import this collection into a workspace. A workspace is a larger container where you might store multiple sets of collections alongside other things. In my case, I'll select this workspace I already have set up. If you don't have any workspaces of your own, just create a new personal workspace and give it a fun name, and then hit import. Postman will think for a little bit, and then we're in our workspace, and here's our Plaid API collection. Ooh, look at all those calls just raring to go. But none of this is going to work yet until I set up my environment, so let's get that started first. So head on over to the Environments tab here. Environments are basically just collections of variables that Postman can load up as needed when you're making your API calls. Developers will sometimes have like one set of variables set up to talk to like a test server, another one set up to talk to a production service or that sort of thing, and they'll switch back and forth between these environments as needed. So right now we only have one called Sandbox, and we're going to use that to talk to the Sandbox environment. And you can see up here, the first two variables we need to fill out are our client ID and our secret. Remember how I told you we'd be playing the part of our server? And that one reason Plaid can trust our server is that we're able to send across a client ID and secret with every call? Well, that's what we're going to do here by filling these values in. Postman will then read those in and send them across with every API call we make. So to get these values, head on over to dashboard.plaid.com and sign into your Plaid dashboard account if you haven't done that yet. Click on Team Settings and then go to Keys. This first value here is our client ID. So I'm going to copy this and I'm going to paste it into the current value field here. Next, I'm going to need a client secret. Now, depending on your situation, you might have 1, 2, or maybe even 3 choices of secrets depending on what environment you want to use. Let's talk about those. So Sandbox is basically used for development and experimentation purposes. You have nearly unlimited use of all the Plaid products for free, but you're not going to be touching any real data. All the data you're reading in will be fake, and you won't actually be affecting any user data, which, if you think about it, is probably a good thing while you're making these test calls. Development is used for testing out your application against real data. Like Sandbox mode, it is free to use, but you're usually limited to about 100 logins or items. So you'll typically use this with a small pool of trusted testers or maybe just your development team when you're ready to see how your application works with real banks. Production, which I don't have here, is when you want to use Plaid's products out in the real world. You have access to real data, and there aren't really any limits like there are in development, but you will start paying for the products you're using. Because we're dealing with real money here, you'll need to fill out a few forms and get approval from the Plaid team before you can use the production environment and possibly development too. So for our purpose today, we'll be using Sandbox. It's free to use, we won't be accessing any actual customer data, and it gives us some secret debugging powers, which you'll see a bit later. So I'm going to copy my Sandbox secret and paste it into this field here. And I do want to stress this should be kept secret. If a nefarious character were to get access to this secret, they could start making calls on behalf of your application. So, treat it the same way you would any other password. Or, if you're one of those people that likes to write passwords on Post-it notes, treat it better than you would any other password. That's also why I'm pasting it into this current value field. The difference between these two fields is that anything in the initial value field will get copied around if you were to, say, share this environment with team members or something. The current value field stays local on your machine. And I would say you should default to that behavior unless you're definitely sure you want to be sharing these values around. Make sure to click Save. I frequently forget that step. And now we've got our client ID and secret set up in our Sandbox environment. The next important step we need to do is actually start using this environment. So select this drop-down box up here and pick Sandbox. So now let's try making a call. I'm going to go back to my collection. I will select balance and retrieve balance. This is a call that will let me retrieve real-time account balance information for my users. So I'll click send and, I'm getting an error. It's telling us that our request doesn't have an access token. Remember that bit, the part that says we have permission to access this user's information? Well, we need to get that. Now, as you recall, normally this would require having our user sign in through links so they can send us a public token to exchange for an access token. But the nice thing about being in Sandbox mode is that we have a very special call that says, hey, let's just pretend like our user signed into a bank, created an item on the back end, and gave us back a public token. It's this one here under Items, Item Creation, called Create Item Sandbox Only. So I'm going to click Send here, and you can see what we get back is a public token. Now all we need to do is exchange that for an access token, which we can do here in the Exchange Token call. So I'm going to send that, and you can see that what I get back is an access token, which, conveniently is exactly the thing we needed to make that earlier call. So let's go back to that balance call and try it one more time. And look at that. I can see that we now have a list of our users' accounts alongside their current balance, as well as some additional information about each account. And in case you're wondering how this call knew about the access token we got earlier without my having to cut and paste anything, don't worry, I'll explain that bit of magic in a bit. So now that we have a working call, let me give you a quick tour of some of the extra interface features here so you can see what we're working with. Up here is the actual URL of the call we're making. This env URL in double brackets is basically saying, hey, go find the value of env URL in our current environment and use it here. And if we look at our Sandbox environment, you can see that env URL is equal to sandbox.plaid.com. So this call is basically going to sandbox.plaid.com/account/balance/get. In fact, I could just type that in here and not use the environment variable at all, and the call would work just the same, at least, until I decide to change my environment. So let's undo that for now. Post is the type of call we're making. There are a few types of calls that you can make using HTTP. Get and post are the most common, and just about every Plaid call is a post call. These next few tabs down here are all ways you can add information to this request. These first three you probably won't touch much. Params here would be if you wanted to add URL parameters to the call. Like these things you typically see up here. Plaid doesn't actually use these very much. Authorization headers would be if you needed to add some authorization data to your request in very specific ways. Again, Plaid doesn't typically use these. Headers will allow you to send data across in HTTP headers. This is mostly used for metadata, that is data about your data, things like the date of the request, how large your request is, and how we want to accept data. In Plaid's Postman collection, we have one header manually filled out for you, and it's this one here that says we'll accept content in the form of JSON. This is required for all of our calls. You might sometimes also send across your Plaid client ID and secret as headers. That's what our client libraries do. But you can also do it another way, and that's to send it as part of the message body. So this body section is a JSON object that represents all of the data you'd want to send across with your request. If you want to try modifying any of the requests that are included as part of the Postman collection, 99% of the time you would do that by changing what's in the message body here. In the case of balance, we're only sending across three pieces of information: the client ID, the secret, and the access token. And again, these double curly brackets here mean that we're grabbing these actual values from the environment variables that we set up earlier. Now, a full tutorial on how to modify these message bodies is probably out of scope for this video, But the quick version is this. Your message body is in the form of a JSON object. A JSON object basically is a set of key value pairs wrapped in curly brackets. The keys are strings like this, and the values are typically strings, numbers, booleans, arrays, or smaller JSON-y objects. Now you can see a list of all the valid fields and their data types by going to the documentation for any specific call. For instance, here in the balance request documentation, I can see that it has an options object where I can pass in an array of account IDs if I want to retrieve balance information for just a subset of my accounts. That's why string is in square brackets like this. It means an array of strings. And in fact, over here, if I make sure I have curl selected from my list of dropdowns, you can kind of see an example of what this JSON object might look like. So let's modify my request here to only request the balance information for this first checking account. I'm actually going to right click and select duplicate here so I don't mess up my original call, and I'll rename it to like retrieve balance single account. And then I can go over to my message body, add in a key of options, in quotes, then some curly brackets to represent my smaller object, then a key of account IDs, and then an array, the square brackets, that includes this first account ID that I will copy and paste. Postman is complaining here because I don't have a comma. All your key value pairs do need to be separated by commas to be valid JSON, so we can add that. I'll run this once again, and you can see I now only get this one account in my results. All right, so let's go back to my original call and move on to these other sections here. So pre-request script is a place where you could run some special JavaScript code before sending off this request. We don't really make use of this, but this test tab is a place where you can run JavaScript code after getting back a response. Honestly, it's a bit of a misleading name. It should probably be called like post-response script or something. And we actually do make use of this in a few places. Let me show you. Let me go back to that create item call. See this script here? This is basically the little bit of magic that's taking the public token value we get back from our call and setting it as an environment variable. So then this exchange token call grabs that value from our environment, again, note the double curly brackets, and sends it off with this call. When we get back the access token, we have another script here that then sets that as another environment variable. And that's why our calls are magically working now. Because the script sets our access token as an environment variable, all of our calls are now able to read that and send it across in the message body. And don't worry if you didn't follow what I just said, you probably won't touch this field much, but since it shows up occasionally, I thought it was worth pointing out how we use it. Finally, settings contains a bunch of settings that honestly I wouldn't mess with unless you really know what you're doing. And then down here, we've got a few different ways you can review the response that you get back. For now, the one I would focus on is this pretty tab, which shows you the raw data with like just some nice indentations and color coding and stuff. Also, you can collapse certain sections, which is pretty useful because our responses get pretty verbose. At some point, we might add support for this visualize tab, which would like show your data with some fancy HTML and CSS, so it's a little more readable. But at the time of this recording, it doesn't really do anything. Okay, over on the side here, you might notice how each of our calls has the actual call and then like this OK thing underneath it. This thing is basically a hard-coded example of what the data retrieved from this call might look like. It is nice, but I prefer getting back the actual results from the API if I can. Finally, if you're really interested in seeing the completely raw request that gets sent out and the response we get back, check out the little console tab down here. You can expand any of these requests to see the entire flow. Okay, with that under our proverbial belt, let me give you a quick tour of all these different endpoints and what they do. Link tokens are endpoints to help you configure Link, the client-side widget that helps the user sign into their bank. We're not going to be using them here, but in a real application, you would have your server talk to these endpoints before your user connects their bank to Plaid. As you recall, items are the thing that represents the user's login with their bank. Use the item creation endpoints to create those debug items. And then in items management here, we can get information about the item we created. This one here will tell you some of the basics of the item currently associated with this access token, like what institution we're connected to, what Plaid products work with this item, and so on. This one lets us get a list of accounts that this item is associated with, along with their name and balance and so on. You'll find that a lot of our calls will start by always returning a list of accounts at the top, so you might need to collapse that section to get to the data you're actually interested in. For instance, auth here will get us account IDs and routing numbers for checking and savings accounts. This is really helpful for developers that are looking to transfer money in or out of banks, and you need to get this data from the user. Transactions will let us get a list of recent transactions from our user, or I guess it would have if we had enabled the product. One thing I didn't mention earlier is that when you set up a connection with Plaid, it does sometimes help to explicitly list what products you want to activate. But for a few reasons, one of which being that you sometimes get charged per product, it's highly recommended you only specify the products you're actually going to use. So if we go back to our item creation endpoint, we can see that we've only explicitly activated auth. Balance works too because we kind of get that for free when we enable any other product. And I think we did that to really emphasize the fact that you only want to activate what you're going to need. But you know what? I'm going to live life on the edge here and change this initial products list to include several more products. Make sure they're in quotes and comma separated, and then go ahead and add transactions, identity, assets, liabilities, investments, and transfer. That's transfer singular, not plural. So I'm going to run this again, and eventually, I get back a new public token. And remember what to do once we get back this public token? That's right, we go to this exchange token call and exchange it for an access token. And again, that post response script will set this new access token as an environment variable for us. So now I can go back to transactions, and if I run it again, we get a ton of information about your user's recent transactions. It's great if you're building some kind of like personal finance app. We called balance before, but again, this gets you a list of balances for all your users' accounts. Now, this might look similar to what you saw when getting an accounts list, but these are a lot more real time. A lot of apps use this call before performing money transfer types of actions so they can confirm that the user has enough money in their account to perform a transfer. Identity will get you the user's identity that is stored with their bank. You can see it here in the accounts section. You've got like the owner's mailing address and full name and sometimes other information. This is useful in situations where you want to make sure your customer is really who they say they are. I know this can certainly help with a lot of the know your customer compliance types of issues. Assets will let you create an asset report that is a summary of all your users' assets and liabilities from this institution, often with historical balances as well. This can be very useful information for like approving certain larger types of loans. Generally speaking, this is a two-step process where you ask to create an asset report and then several minutes later you retrieve it. However, because we're using our fictional sandbox bank, the report is available right away, so I can just click this endpoint and retrieve the report we just asked to create. Liabilities gives us more information about any loans or credit cards the user has with this bank, what type of loan it is, when the next payment is due, what the interest rate is, and so on. Again, this can be helpful for approving certain types of loans, but also sometimes for helping your customers find like better deals on their current loans or credit cards. Investments will get you a list of your users' investment data. Up here, you'll see the amount they have, their cost basis, and so on. But then this security ID value here will correspond with the entries down here, where you can get more details about the security, like the closing price, the name, the ticker symbol, and so on. Institution is useful for searching for or grabbing some basic information about a specific financial institution, like their name, what products they support, and so on. Webhooks are a way for Plaid to communicate back to your application server. Typically, your server will have its own HTTP endpoint established where you can receive information from Plaid proactively. This might be for things like a user's item has stopped working and they need to sign in again, or the asset report you requested is now ready, or we have new data available in some of our products. Now, Plaid will send across these webhooks, even in sandbox mode, as part of its normal operation. But this call here will let you manually trigger a couple of webhooks from Plaid, which can be useful if you just want to make sure your mechanism for receiving webhooks works in the first place. Then down here are a few products that I can't completely use right now in Postman, either because they're still in beta or I don't have access to them, but are definitely products you might want to look at in the future. Payment initiation is a product available in the UK and EU that lets you transfer funds directly into another bank account. This test bank I'm using is based in the US, so I can't use this product. Processors is useful if you're working with a third-party payment processor like Dwolla or a couple dozen others that we've partnered with to manage bank-to-bank kinds of transactions. It basically allows you to share sensitive information like bank account and routing numbers with these processors without having to actually store and share that information yourself. Transfer is kind of the US equivalent of payment initiation. It allows you to transfer money between different banks using Plaid as the payment processor instead of a third party. This is currently in beta, so we don't have access to it right now. And then income can help users verify their sources of income by either connecting directly with their payroll provider, uploading pay stubs, or finding recurring bank deposits. Again, this can be really useful for things like securing loans for your users, and you want to be confident they can pay you back. Now, this product is brand new at the time of this recording, so it turns out that whole, let's pretend we got a public token from our user thing in Sandbox, That doesn't completely work with income, but you can take a look at this example here and see what kind of data you might get back from this endpoint. So there you go. Those are the basics for getting started with Postman to play around with the Plaid endpoints. I encourage you to check out all these calls and see what Plaid can do, and maybe when you're ready, give the Quick Start application a try so you can see these calls in practice. In the meantime, make sure to check out the documentation for more information, subscribe to our YouTube channel so you can see more of my smiling face, and I will see you soon on another episode of Plaid Academy.